Picture this. Nearly 6,000 American Marines, completely surrounded, cut off from ground resupply, watching enemy soldiers dig trenches closer and closer to their perimeter every single night. The parallels to one of France's most catastrophic military defeats were so obvious that even President Lyndon Johnson couldn't sleep. He had a scale model of the base built inside the White House Situation Room so he could stare at it and worry. That is how serious this was. That is how close the entire strategic picture in Vietnam came to collapsing in the opening weeks of 1968. Welcome back. Today we are talking about the Siege of Khe Sanh, one of the most intense, most debated, and most dramatic military confrontations of the entire Vietnam War. 77 days of artillery barrages, tunnel digging, close-range firefights, and relentless psychological pressure. The North Vietnamese army committed somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 troops to this operation, surrounding an isolated Marine combat base in the northwestern corner of South Vietnam, right up against the Laotian border, sitting in a foggy highland valley that seemed almost designed by geography to trap whoever tried to hold it. But here is what makes Khe Sanh so fascinating, so worth really digging into. The North Vietnamese thought they were about to repeat history. They thought they were about to deliver a blow so devastating, so symbolically perfect, that it would shatter American will and force a political settlement on their terms. They were wrong. And the story of why they were wrong, the story of how those Marines held on, how American air power rewrote the rules of what a surrounded garrison could survive, is something that every person interested in military history needs to understand. So, let us go back. Let us set the scene properly, because context is everything with Khe Sanh. By late 1967, the war in Vietnam had ground into something that satisfied nobody. American commanders under General William Westmoreland were pursuing a strategy built around attrition, killing enemy soldiers faster than North Vietnam could replace them, using superior firepower and mobility to grind down the People's Army of Vietnam. The body counts were impressive on paper. The strategic results were far less clear. North Vietnamese leadership under General Vo Nguyen Giap was planning something extraordinary, a coordinated nationwide offensive timed for the Tet holiday season that would strike simultaneously at dozens of South Vietnamese cities and military installations. The goal was to trigger a popular uprising among the South Vietnamese population, demonstrate that the Saigon government was hollow, and show American voters that the war was unwinnable, regardless of what their government told them. But Giap needed something else first. He needed to pull American attention, American reinforcements, and American strategic thinking away from the populated coastal cities where most of the South Vietnamese population actually lived. He needed a distraction, a magnet, something that would fix American forces in place out in the remote highlands while the real blow landed elsewhere. Khe Sanh was perfect for this purpose, or at least that is one interpretation. Military historians still argue about exactly what Giap was thinking, and we will get back to that debate because it matters for understanding the outcome. The Khe Sanh combat base sat on a plateau roughly 6 kilometers long near the Rao Quan River in Quang Tri province. The surrounding area was dominated by hills with names that would become famous among veterans: Hills 881 South, 881 North, 861, 950. These heights commanded the approaches to the base and to Route 9, the only major road in the area. Whoever controlled those hills could observe and fire down onto the base below. The Marines understood this. They had positioned outposts on several of these hills specifically to prevent the enemy from using them as artillery platforms. The strategic logic of American presence at Khe Sanh had evolved over years. The base had originally been established to monitor infiltration along the Ho Chi Minh Trail network coming through Laos. It sat near potential invasion corridors that North Vietnamese forces might use to cut South Vietnam in half or swing around the northern defenses. General Westmoreland actually saw Khe Sanh as more than a defensive position. He envisioned it as a potential launch point for operations into Laos to cut the trail itself though those plans never materialized due to political constraints. By January 1968, the base was garrisoned primarily by the 26th Marine Regiment under Colonel David Lowndes. The Marines had roughly 3,500 men at the main base, with additional companies on the surrounding hill outposts. They knew something was coming. Aerial reconnaissance and intelligence reports through late 1967 had tracked massive North Vietnamese troop movements converging on the area. 2 full divisions of the People's Army of Vietnam were positioning around them. The 325C Division to the northwest, the 304th Division approaching from the southwest through Laos. Additional independent regiments and support units swelled the total enemy force to figures that gave American planners genuine nightmares. The opening blow came on January 21, 1968, when North Vietnamese forces launched a coordinated pre-dawn assault on Hill 861, while simultaneously opening a devastating artillery and rocket barrage on the main base. The attack on Hill 861 was repulsed by Kappa Company of the 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines, in brutal close-quarters fighting that lasted through the night. But the barrage on the main base was catastrophic in a different way. A rocket or mortar round, the exact cause was never definitively established, struck the main ammunition dump. Over 1,500 tons of munitions cooked off in a chain reaction that shook the ground for miles. The base lost most of its artillery ammunition in one terrible morning, and that ammunition dump fire became one of the iconic images of the entire Vietnam War. Now, here is where we need to talk about the ghost that haunted every conversation about Khe Sanh from the very beginning: Dien Bien Phu. In 1954, French forces at a remote valley base in northern Vietnam had been surrounded by Viet Minh forces under the same General Giap, who was now commanding North Vietnamese operations. The French had believed their firepower and fortifications would hold. They were wrong. Giap's forces dug approach trenches that negated French firepower advantages, brought artillery to commanding positions, and, after 56 days of fighting, overran the garrison. The French defeat at Dien Bien Phu effectively ended French rule in Indochina. The parallels to Khe Sanh were impossible to ignore. Both were remote valley bases surrounded by hills. Both were cut off from reliable ground resupply. Both faced an enemy willing to absorb massive casualties to achieve a politically transformative victory. Giap himself had been the architect of Dien Bien Phu. Now he seemed to be setting up the same play against the Americans. The psychological weight of this comparison pressed down on everyone. Washington officials demanded daily briefings. Westmoreland flew in to personally assess the situation. General Earl Wheeler, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, pointedly asked Westmoreland to confirm that Khe Sanh would not become another Dien Bien Phu. Westmoreland's answer was confident, but the question itself revealed how much the spectre of 1954 was driving American thinking. But there was a fundamental difference between 1954 and 1968, and it was a difference measured in jet fuel, laser designators, and the sheer industrial capacity of American military aviation. The Americans had air power of a scale and sophistication that the French could not have imagined. This would be the decisive variable. Westmoreland authorized Operation Niagara, a name chosen to evoke the image of steel and explosives falling like water. The operation had 2 phases. Niagara, 1, was an intensive intelligence collection effort, combining aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, sensor technology, and ground observation to map every North Vietnamese position, supply route, and troop concentration around Khe Sanh with unprecedented precision. Niagara 2 was what that intelligence enabled: a coordinated, continuous air campaign that would make the ground around Khe Sanh the most heavily bombed piece of real estate in the history of warfare up to that point. Let us talk about the numbers, because they are genuinely staggering. Over the course of the siege, American aircraft flew approximately 24,000 tactical air sorties and delivered about 96,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnamese positions around Khe Sanh. The B-52 Stratofortress strategic bombers flew in arc-light missions, dropping their enormous payloads from high altitude in patterns designed to saturate large areas. These bombers could carry over 30 tons of bombs each and flew in cells of 3 aircraft, carpeting hundreds of meters of jungle with explosions that could kill soldiers in their bunkers from concussive force alone. The sensor technology used was itself remarkable. The Muscle Shoals program had scattered acoustic and seismic sensors along trails and likely movement corridors. These sensors transmitted data to aircraft overhead that relayed it to a processing center in Thailand. When North Vietnamese troops or vehicles moved, the sensors triggered, the data was processed, and within minutes, strike aircraft could be on target. This was an early precursor to the networked battlefield concept that would define American military doctrine decades later. For the Marines on the ground, survival during the siege was a daily exercise in discipline, ingenuity, and controlled fear. The North Vietnamese artillery and rocket fire was relentless. The base had over 1,000 incoming rounds on some days. The Marines learned to live underground, reinforcing their positions with sandbags and timber, moving through communication trenches to minimize exposure. The red clay soil of the Khe Sanh plateau was perfect for digging, which was both a blessing for the defenders and a problem because it made it equally easy for the attackers to dig their approach trenches closer and closer to the perimeter wire. Resupply became a central challenge and a daily drama. The airstrip at Khe Sanh was under constant observation and regular fire. Landing a transport aircraft meant running a gauntlet of enemy anti-aircraft fire and the risk of artillery hitting the strip at the worst possible moment. Air Force and Marine pilots developed techniques for what they called the Khe Sanh approach, a steep dive designed to minimize the time spent in the most vulnerable altitude band, followed by a quick offload and immediate departure. Crews would keep their engines running and the aircraft moving while cargo handlers pushed supplies off the ramp at speed. Some aircraft were hit, some were destroyed on the ground. The crews who flew those missions deserved every decoration they received. The C-130 Hercules workhorse transport was eventually deemed too large and too valuable to risk on the strip during the most intense periods, and the Air Force developed parachute extraction systems and low-altitude parachute delivery to drop supplies without landing. Smaller C-123 provider aircraft continued making ground landings throughout much of the siege. Helicopters, despite their vulnerability to ground fire, were essential for supplying the isolated hill outposts where no fixed-wing aircraft could land at all. Speaking of those hill outposts, their experience deserves special attention because it illustrates the true brutality of the siege. The Marines on Hill 861 Alpha, positioned to provide observation and to block one of the primary North Vietnamese approach routes, endured particularly intense combat. In the early morning hours of February 5th, North Vietnamese forces launched a massive assault on 861 Alpha, penetrating the wire and overrunning portions of the perimeter. The Marines fought in hand-to-hand combat to retake their positions, ultimately repelling the assault but at savage cost. Similar attacks struck Hill 64 and other outpost positions throughout the siege. The Special Forces camp at Lang Vey, located about 9 kilometers southwest of Khe Sanh, was overrun on February 7th in an attack that shocked American commanders. North Vietnamese forces used PT-76 amphibious light tanks in this assault, the first time enemy armor had been used in the Vietnam War. The defenders at Lang Vey, a combination of Green Berets and South Vietnamese civilian irregular defense group soldiers, called desperately for relief. The decision not to send a Marine relief column from Khe Sanh, due to the risk of an ambush, was one of the most agonizing command decisions of the entire siege. The Lang Vey defenders fought with extraordinary courage, but the camp fell. Most of the survivors eventually made it to Khe Sanh, but the loss of Lang Vey demonstrated that North Vietnamese commanders were not simply sitting back and absorbing airstrikes. They were probing, attacking, and looking for weaknesses. Throughout all of this, the American media was broadcasting the story to living rooms across the United States. The Tet Offensive had launched on January 30th and 31st, just days after the Khe Sanh siege began, and the combination of the two created a news environment of crisis and doubt. Television cameras captured Viet Cong infiltrators inside the American embassy compound in Saigon. Street fighting raged in Hue, and in the Highlands, Marines at Khe Sanh were apparently being besieged by a vastly superior force in a replay of France's greatest disaster. Walter Cronkite traveled to Vietnam and returned to deliver his famous editorial, concluding that the war was a stalemate and the only rational way out was negotiation. When Lyndon Johnson reportedly said that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost Middle America, it captured something real about the psychological impact of events in early 1968. The connection between Tet, Khe Sanh, and the collapse of American public confidence in the war's management cannot be overstated. But here is the military reality that the media coverage sometimes obscured. The Marines at Khe Sanh were holding. They were not just holding on in some desperate last stand sense. They were systematically destroying the enemy forces around them, primarily through air power, but also through aggressive patrolling, counter-battery fire, and defensive tactics that made every North Vietnamese infantry assault enormously costly. The North Vietnamese were trying to do what Giap had done at Dien Bien Phu, advance their trenches progressively toward the American perimeter in a classic siege approach. But every time a significant concentration of enemy soldiers or equipment was identified, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Arc-light missions were coordinated directly with the ground commanders. When sensors detected movement in a particular grid square, bombers were overhead within hours. The soil of Quang Tri province was saturated with the explosive yield of tens of thousands of bombs. North Vietnamese soldiers in the area spoke after the war of the psychological effect of constant B-52 strikes, the ground shaking with no warning, the inability to predict where the next strike would fall, the helplessness of being targeted by aircraft they could not see or hear until the bombs were already falling. The approach trenches that were supposed to slowly throttle the base advanced fitfully under this pressure. They never reached the completion that would have allowed a coordinated infantry assault on the main perimeter in the way that Giap's forces had overwhelmed the French at Dien Bien Phu. It is worth pausing here to examine the debate about North Vietnamese intentions more carefully, because it matters for evaluating who actually won this battle strategically. One interpretation, dominant in American military circles during and immediately after the battle, was that Khe Sanh was Giap's main effort, that he genuinely intended to overrun the base, capture or destroy the garrison, and produce the Dien Bien Phu moment that would shatter American will. Under this interpretation, the Marines and American air power won a clear military victory by defeating a major enemy offensive. The other interpretation, which gained credibility as more information emerged about North Vietnamese planning, was that Khe Sanh was primarily a diversion, that Giap's real objective was the Tet offensive against South Vietnam's cities, and that drawing American forces and attention to the remote highlands served his strategic purpose, regardless of whether Khe Sanh itself was overrun. Under this interpretation, whether the Marines held Khe Sanh was almost beside the point. The siege succeeded in pulling Westmoreland's attention away from the cities, forcing the commitment of air assets and resources to the highlands, and creating the political and media crisis that accompanied Tet. The honest answer is probably that both things were true simultaneously, that Giap was willing to take Khe Sanh if the opportunity presented itself, that he positioned forces capable of doing so, but that the operation's value to him was primarily strategic and political rather than purely military. The base's capture would have been a spectacular bonus. Its survival did not necessarily represent a North Vietnamese defeat at the operational level. This ambiguity is part of what makes Khe Sanh so intellectually rich as a case study. Military victory and strategic success are not always the same thing. As February gave way to March, the intensity of the siege gradually began to shift. The Tet offensive in the cities had been militarily defeated. Viet Cong infrastructure across South Vietnam had been largely destroyed in the fighting, representing a long-term blow to North Vietnamese irregular warfare capability, even though the political damage to American public opinion was severe. Without the Tet Offensive as context, the pressure to maintain forces at Khe Sanh at any cost began to ease somewhat. North Vietnamese forces around Khe Sanh began thinning in late March. Intelligence reports indicated that significant elements of the besieging force were withdrawing. Patrols outside the wire encountered less resistance. The rain of incoming artillery and rockets, while never entirely ceasing, became less intense. American commanders authorized Operation Pegasus in early April 1968. This was the Overland Relief Operation, a combined arms effort by the 1st Cavalry Division, working with South Vietnamese airborne units to punch through from the east along Route 9 and link up with the Khe Sanh garrison. The 1st Cavalry used its helicopter mobility to leapfrog forward along the route, seizing terrain, clearing North Vietnamese positions, and advancing the ground link-up, while Marine and Army units pushed along the road itself. Operation Pegasus launched on April 1st and reached Khe Sanh on April 8th. The Marines at the base pushed out to link up, and the siege was officially lifted. What followed was a sweep of the surrounding terrain that found ample evidence of the devastation wrought on the North Vietnamese forces. Weapons, equipment, thousands of bodies, destroyed bunker complexes, all testified to the price paid by the besieging force. The final casualty numbers are revealing. American forces at Khe Sanh suffered around 274 killed in action during the siege, with over 1,000 wounded. These are terrible losses, representing real human tragedies for hundreds of American families. But they are dramatically lower than what Dien Bien Phu cost the French. The North Vietnamese casualty figures are harder to pin down precisely, as they always are in Vietnam War accounting, but estimates range from 10,000 to 15,000 killed around Khe Sanh during the siege period. Even accounting for the inevitable inflation of enemy body count estimates in Vietnam reporting, it is clear that the air campaign inflicted disproportionate losses on the besieging force. Then came the decision that infuriated many of the Marines who had fought to hold the base. In June 1968, just 2 months after the siege was lifted, American commanders ordered Khe Sanh Combat Base abandoned. The 26th Marines dismantled their positions and withdrew. The base was demolished to prevent its use by enemy forces. Within weeks, North Vietnamese forces had reoccupied the plateau. This decision generated enormous controversy and continues to be debated. The argument for abandonment was straightforward. Westmoreland had been replaced by General Creighton Abrams, who had a fundamentally different strategic vision. Abrams was shifting emphasis away from large unit search and destroy operations and toward pacification, population security, and building South Vietnamese military capability. In this new strategy, a remote highland outpost that required enormous resources to supply and defend, that offered little direct protection to the Vietnamese population, and that contributed primarily to an attrition strategy Abrams was abandoning, simply did not make operational sense to maintain. For the Marines who had bled for every inch of that red clay soil, who had watched friends die in the artillery barrages and the night assaults, the abandonment felt like betrayal. How do you justify the cost if you just hand it back? The question had no satisfying answer, but military history is full of positions that were worth holding at a particular moment and worth abandoning at a later one when strategic circumstances changed. The value of Khe Sanh in early 1968 was partly tactical and partly symbolic. Once the siege was lifted and the strategic situation stabilized, its value diminished while its cost remained high. Reasonable people can disagree about whether abandonment was the right call, but it was not an irrational one. What are the broader lessons and significance of Khe Sanh? First, the battle demonstrated definitively what American air power could accomplish in a static defensive situation when targeting intelligence was good and weather permitted sustained operations. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. 96,000 tons of bombs on a relatively small geographic area. That firepower calculation utterly transformed what it meant to besiege an American position. Giap could dig approach trenches. He could not protect his soldiers from constant bombardment, that located them partly through their own movement along those trenches. Second, Khe Sanh illustrated the critical importance of sensor technology and intelligence processing in modern warfare. The Muscle Shoals sensor program, the real-time data processing, the rapid tasking of strike aircraft, these were not just technical innovations. They were a genuine change in military capability that allowed American forces to see the battlefield with unprecedented clarity and respond with unprecedented speed. The conceptual lineage from those systems to modern networked warfare is direct and traceable. Third, the battle highlighted the often painful gap between military success and strategic outcome. The Marines at Khe Sanh won their fight. They held their position, inflicted catastrophic losses on the enemy, and demonstrated that surrounding an American garrison with overwhelming numbers was not sufficient to capture it. Yet the broader strategic picture in Vietnam in 1968 moved in directions that ultimately led to American withdrawal 5 years later. Military victory does not automatically translate into political and strategic success, a lesson that seems to require relearning in every generation. Fourth, Khe Sanh showed something important about the human dimensions of siege warfare. The Marines who endured those 77 days were not just passive recipients of enemy fire waiting for rescue. They were active participants in their own defense, running aggressive patrols, maintaining combat effectiveness under conditions of extraordinary stress, sustaining morale through unit cohesion, leadership, and the Marine Corps culture of institutional toughness. The psychological preparation embedded in Marine training proved as important as the physical fortifications. The veterans of Khe Sanh carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. Some were able to process it and find meaning in what they had survived and accomplished. Others carried wounds that never fully healed, the weight of the friends they lost, the frustration of the political outcome after so much sacrifice, the particular bitterness of watching the base abandoned. The Vietnam War generation of American veterans was treated in ways that shamed the nation that sent them to fight, and the veterans of Khe Sanh were part of that larger tragedy. If you want to understand Khe Sanh more deeply, several excellent histories explore it in detail. Robert Pizor's account of the battle remains one of the most vivid. Eric Hamel's Khe Sanh Siege is a comprehensive operational history drawing on extensive veteran interviews. The first-person accounts of participants, scattered through memoirs and oral history collections, bring the human experience to life in ways that statistics and operational summaries cannot. Vietnam War history is endlessly complex, precisely because it sits at the intersection of military operations, strategic policy, domestic politics, media, and the moral questions about the war's justification. Khe Sanh does not resolve any of those big questions. What it does is provide an extraordinarily sharp focus on what it meant to fight and survive in that war, what American military capability could and could not accomplish, and how individual courage operated within a larger strategic context that was not fully in the control of the people doing the fighting. General Giap, whatever his actual intentions at Khe Sanh, lived to 96 years old and never stopped being willing to explain his strategic thinking. His account of Khe Sanh emphasized that the operation served its purpose within the broader context of the Tet Offensive and the political campaign to force American withdrawal. American veterans and historians have pushed back on this framing, arguing that Giap's post hoc rationalization of a military defeat is exactly what you would expect from a commander explaining why his forces took catastrophic casualties without achieving their stated objectives. The truth, as is often the case in military history, sits somewhere in the complicated middle ground, where operational outcomes, strategic intent, and political consequences do not line up into clean narratives with clear winners and losers. What we can say with confidence is this: 6,000 American Marines and their supporting elements held a position under conditions that would have broken most armies in history. They held it through discipline, through air power, through innovation, and through a willingness to fight and die for each other that transcended the politics of the larger war. Whatever you think about the Vietnam War, whatever you think about American policy in Southeast Asia, those Marines at Khe Sanh in 1968 deserve to be remembered as soldiers who faced something genuinely terrifying and did not break. That is the story of Khe Sanh. 77 days of siege, tens of thousands of bombs, thousands of enemy dead in the jungle, and at the end of it, a base that still flew the American flag. North Vietnam had thrown 2 divisions and the ghost of Dien Bien Phu at that red clay plateau, and it was not enough. If you found this history valuable, hit subscribe, because we cover these kinds of deep dives into military history every week. Leave a comment below telling me which aspect of Khe Sanh surprised you most, whether it is the air power numbers, the intelligence technology, or the ultimate decision to abandon the base after all that sacrifice. And check out the next video, because we are going to stay in Vietnam and look at the Battle of Hue, the urban fighting that happened simultaneously with Khe Sanh and cost America and South Vietnam dearly in ways that the jungle fighting never quite captured. See you there.